Welcome everyone to Feminists Yearning, Imagining, and Organizing for Just Peace and Genuine Security. And thank you for being with us. Before we begin our program, we acknowledge the lives taken by the corona pandemic, by state violence, by violence rooted in the intersections of misogyny, racism, classism, transphobia, among other forms of oppression. We, meaning the organizers, peace women across the globe, we're in ethical solidarity with the struggle for Black lives, with struggles against colonialism and imperialism everywhere. So we say this is not a moment for silence, but instead a time to pause, to let this extraordinary moment enter the room. We also acknowledge the original people of the land, wherever we are. And in some places, their land was stolen, colonized, and everything of value extracted, including human beings, natural resources, and sacred objects. Therefore, we invite our ancestors, our spiritual guides, our comrades, friends, and family also to enter, because we believe they'll guide us through our gathering today so that we can bring our best selves into this space that we've carefully crafted. And of course, we thank the organizers of the 7th South-South Forum on Sustainability and the Global University for Sustainability and Lingnan University for hosting our 2 days, right? Our organization, Peace Women Across the Globe, was invited by Professor Kiu Chi to organize 2 days, imagine 2 full days, devoted to feminist conversations about life and death issues for women and the planet. And so to tell you a brief history and something about Peace Women Across the Globe, our founder, Ruth-Gaby VERMOT, will speak first. Thank you, Gabi.
It's wonderful to see you. It is a 4th session and I could work like this every day. It's lovely to work like this. It's lovely to be here. It's lovely to see you. And I feel good with you. I feel very good with you. And thank you so much, Kiu Chi and Margo, to have organized with the interpreters, with Lee Seung, with all these wonderful women, these sessions. I'm Ruth-Gaby VERMOT. I'm the president, the co-president with Kamla Basin in India from Peace Women Across the Globe. This is an organization who was founded in 2005. We nominated 1,000 women for the Nobel Peace Prize. And some of you were already wonderful coordinators, and we shared amazing and crazy time during 3 years to nominate all these 1,000 women. We wanted the world to get involved in women's peace work. With the coordinators around the world, we found so many women committed to peaceful coexistence, who tirelessly pointed out the devastated climate, who made public the violations of human rights, abuse by politics, exclusion, and violence against women, often at great risk of their own lives. These women and their daily struggles should be visible. This was one of the aims of our organization. The 1,000 women representing hundreds of thousands did not receive the Nobel Peace Prize. Women for the Nobel Peace Prize, it was not so interesting for the people for the men in Norway. That was sad, but as we can see today, the network continues to exist and has become larger. This network is precious, and we all know that together we can make a big difference. We organize also together and together with partner organization in different countries, peace tables. We would like to fulfill that more women are sitting on the peace table around the world. At this moment, only 1.5 women, 1.5 women are sitting on peace table, and that is not the half. So we work together with partner organizations in different countries, and this is a very good feeling to go ahead, to stay in contact with all these women struggling for peace. So I think it is okay. And I wish you, and I wish us all a good session. This is the most important today, that we can discuss about South and North, the relationship between South and North. Okay,
Thank you very much, Gabi. So before I give the overview for our session, I want to just give some prefatory comments. The current moment, as we all are very well aware, the corona pandemic combined with global uprisings and state responses to both, demands us feminists around the world to stand in solidarity. And to do so, we must take the time to think together across regions and other kinds of borders in order to understand the current material conditions and the political situations in more nuanced ways. To imagine feminist futures that will help us be able to secure livelihoods, sustain the natural environment, and ensure the dignity and well-being of all living beings, and to organize transnationally as feminists to realize that vision. We recognize that neoliberal capitalism, right-wing ethno-populism and nationalism, religious fundamentalisms, militarism, colonialism, and imperialism form the foundations of the world in which we exist. Region-specific forms of patriarchy and male dominance, anti-Blackness, and other forms of racism, ethnocentrism, class, and caste, heterosexism and transphobia, ecological violence, and other intertwined life-destroying forces are manifested through and buttressed by those forces. So our sessions are organized around the following concepts and questions. One is each presenter giving us a kind of a summary of the landscape. And in that, we're asking you all to talk about what is this moment telling us societally about what we should let go and change and what we should hold on to and do differently and better. Then we think about yearnings. What one thing is tugging at your hearts and spirits, both personally and politically, in this particular moment? Imaginings, right? If we truly took seriously the answers to the previous questions, what must a feminist future look like, include, and demand? Most fundamentally, what values and principles would be the foundation of our vision? And then finally, what are feminists doing right now that move us toward realizing that vision? And what else will we need to be doing? And so these are our foundational framing questions that we've asked our presenter to discuss. And just for one more piece of context, the series was designed to cover 5 topics that we thought were life and death: ecology, access to land, livelihood, and food security; violence against women; colonization, occupation, militarism, and feminist peace work; ethical solidarity, which is our panel; responsibilities of feminists in the global north, right? And the last one will be the U.S. racial politics, state violence, and global implications. So that's what the whole thing looks like, just for your information. And we hope that there are three, including this one, there are three other sessions coming up. So we hope that you all will be able to attend. So specifically about our session, we called it Ethical Solidarity. And the questions that we're hoping to discuss here is, our workshop is intended to open the discussion of ethical forms of solidarity, addressing the question of responsibility of feminists in the global north towards the effects of historical and present colonization, imperialism, and exploitation of locations in the global south, and the structural inequalities that characterize the relationships between the two. We seek to discuss at least the following questions, right? How must the nation be understood as a critical analytic category? And I would say nation state, alongside gender and other categories. What questions do feminist movements in the global north have to ask ourselves concerning principles of ethical solidarity? And what lessons have we already learned? And how can we apply those lessons? And finally, how should those specific lessons specifically be incorporated into participation in transnational feminist movements, of which this series of workshops is part? So that's kind of the overview, and we can now proceed to hear from our speakers. I will start with our beloved Gabi VERMOT, right? Gabi, along with her feminist colleagues in Switzerland in 2003, founded and organized the initiative 1,000 Women for the Nobel Peace Prize 2005 to make visible and strengthen the mostly unnoticed peace work of women worldwide. That initiative was particularly interested in documenting the work that just ordinary women were doing every day in their lives. Today, she is co-president of the successor organization, as she said, Peace Women Across the Globe, with Indian feminist Kamla Basin. And equally important for the success of our project, the 1,000 Women Project and Peace Women Across the Globe, is that she's a very well-known and very influential feminist leader in Europe. She's a former Swiss parliamentarian and member of the Council of Europe, and a lifelong feminist and women's rights activist. Thank you, Gabi, for having founded us and being on this panel tonight, or in your case, this morning. Thank you. Please.
Thank you, Margo. We are talking about responsibility, how it's divided between North and South. We all know very well how the North, the rich part of the North, pursues in a colonialist manner a policy of exploitation without which the capitalist system would not have survived until today. We also know very well that male dominance has played an important role in the history, which has led to today's dependence. We know that patriarchy always opens the door to capitalism for new forms of exploitation. The concept of housewifery helps us to understand this dynamic of post-colonial exploitation. The concept was developed by Maria Mies, German sociologist, to examine the meaning of women's work in the capitalist system. She used the unremunerated female labor force as a limitless resource to be exploited for the accumulation of profit. Worldwide, it is not only the men who benefit more than the women. Definitively, the North is on the side of the winners. Using a concrete example, I would like to show briefly how the post-colonial circle of exploitation, violence, and repression has a lasting impact on North-South relations, and what the implications are from a feminist perspective. And I will show this in a growing sector of war material production. Switzerland produces war material including weapons, aircraft, tanks, but also spare parts and knowledge. Much of this is exported within the EU, but also to countries in the global south. Thanks in part to civil society initiatives, Switzerland has a law that restricts the export of war material goods. The administration and parliament have the possibility to prohibit the sale of private companies to Saudi Arabia or Pakistan if it can be proven that human rights could be violated. This law was good, but in recent years it has gradually been softened and watered down. Exports to warring countries have become acceptable again. Clearly, this economic sector is extremely lucrative. Profit maximization is possible, still is, and is even increasing. Almost every deal is worthwhile, they say, at least as long as it is possible to hide who is suffering when such war material is used. As long as voters in Switzerland can be convinced that jobs will otherwise be lost, the private sector has a free hand. But it is preciously here that we see how the military structures, their symbolism and supporting ideology are shaped and defined in a patriarchal and colonialist manner. In no other area is it so easy to make visible the effects on the lives of women in conflict areas. And yet it is seldom possible to make the connections so visible that the chance in political direction is achieved. Why? The war material industry is growing rapidly. It is politically well enshrined in the nation-state tradition. It is also a place where post-colonial attitudes are reproduced. Export to countries of the South is one way of perpetuating this dependence. The colonial history of the recipient countries is also characterized by a lack of transparent politics, often weak and corruption, governance, and a system that shows no or only little respect for human rights. The rule of law is weak. Is this being exploited? Is the export of war material party of blame for this development? Yes, and it is bad enough. There are also points that call for loud criticism. For example, the fact that while it is possible to develop ultra-modern military and security technology and might make a profit, the violence of killing and the consequences of war are exported to the countries of the global south. We need to think further, because this sector of the export economy is inhuman in many ways. A lot of violence, death, and hunger are caused locally. Women are often much more affected. They often bear the sole responsibility for the survival of their family because the men are either already killed or absent or injured and in need of care. Women carry a great burden under extremely difficult conditions of war and conflict. Peace-building measures rarely take effect. Neither is the trade in war materials stopped, nor is the impact of export of weapons and knowledge on the everyday life of women in the affected areas analyzed or taken seriously. Otherwise, peace plans would have long since taken on a completely different form, with much more investment in everyday infrastructure in order to make the living conditions of the people more or less bearable, to improve access to education, health, food, to protect, to facilitate, and to give special attention to women's strategies. Because, as we know from case studies and stories, despite the massive danger of feeding their families despite violence and hunger, how do women manage to cope with everyday life? How much do we know about their strategies to show solidarity even across conflict borders in order to organize bread without exposing their families or themselves to too much violence and threats? War material is not just an ordinary export good that might even benefit the local population. On the contrary, this colonial imbalance of power has a particularly serious effect on his lives of women, on their ability to make everyday life worth living, to provide the necessary care. The effects of trade in war material go even further. Many people have to flee, are displaced, stay in the vicinity, or venture further away. The UN Refugee Council speaks of about 65 million of people. Most of them are stranded in the south of the world. A few million are making their way through the deserts and across the Mediterranean to reach Europe. On the road, they are exploited, robbed, or killed. Women are sexually abused. They are victims of trafficking. They bear children they did not want. Their lives are a hell. Their lives are a hell. When they reach a so-called safe country, they are not wanted, because it is clear the post-colonial power relations are evident in that the refugee and migration policies of the countries in the global north have the power to decide who they will allow into the safe countries. Here too, they take it upon themselves to close the borders, to externalize the misery caused by war by building walls. And those who come nevertheless must accept inhuman circumstances. Again, women are exposed to new forms of violence. The shelters for people seeking asylum are not even equipped in such a way that women have their own and local hygiene area. It is still not self-evident that gender-based violence suffered while fleeing would give them the right to good care, health, and security. As feminists, we have a lot to do. in many places. So it is all the more important to have transnational networks, to strengthen transnational exchange, to make experiences and stories public, to build up strategies, pressures. It means having the right and important knowledge to understand and explain all these interdependencies, to prove with facts and figures the damage that this industry, like others, can cause, how massively human rights are being violated, at least when the states of the North are fulfilling the commitments they made by signing the CEDAW Convention. Because that is for sure, the use of war material exposes women in particular. Also, it is preciously they would care for the local people, children, the sick, the elderly, the injured. How can a state afford to act if it is helping the population, knowing that the trade in war material destroys on the fundamental rights of the local population, that the obligations to guarantee the rights of women cannot be fulfilled in this way? Feminists have a demanding task, an ambitious goal, but it must be, it is worth it. There is no alternative. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gabi, for giving us specific examples of the ways in which, in your example, the Swiss corporations are part of creating havoc, and some of the suggestions you made about what Swiss women and women in the North can do. And we'll come back to some of these questions later. But as we move on, I invite you all to think about this question of barbarians. Colonialism and colonization was justified on the idea that everybody except the Europeans were the barbarians, or everybody except the Japanese were the barbarians. And so when we look now and when we look back, who are the real barbarians among us? Cindy, we'll turn to you next. Cindy WIESNER is a dear friend and a 25-year veteran of the social justice movement in the US and internationally. She's the executive director of Grassroots Global Justice Alliance. And she's been active in, oh, I lost my page. Sorry, Cindy. She's been active in very, very many movements in the US. And she is, one of her real strength is that she has the capacity to look beyond the obvious and to challenge conventional ways of understanding things. So in a recent conversation, she and I were talking about the kind of the loose use of the word fascism in the US, and she had an amazing critique about that. So anyway, thank you so much, Cindy, for being here, and please take it away.
So good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you. Really honored to be invited to be part of this dialogue and this series of conversations. Special thanks to the South-South Forum, to Margo, to all the interpreters, and to all the technical team that are making this possible. And to my fellow panelists, sharing and exchanging some ideas and thoughts in this current moment. I wanted to just speak to the four themes, right, around sustainability, what we would also call environmental justice in the context of the United States, around feminisms and peace, and genuine security, and then also the theme of this discussion around ethical solidarity. So I'm going to try to weave those thematics into what I wanted to share today. As Margo said, I work with Grassroots Global Justice Alliance, which is a US-based North American alliance of grassroots and community-based organizations. We are multiracial, we are multi-sectoral, we're intergenerational, and we really see ourselves as a movement building vehicle. Not only trying to build relationships and trust amongst a multiracial, multi-sectoral, intergenerational, all gender alliance, but we also see ourselves as a bridge builder to a lot of our counterparts, international social movements from around the world. And we were born out of the World Social Forum process. And part of that process, I think in our DNA, was very clear. How do we think about, sort of root causes to the issues that many of our people, not only in the United States, but around the world are facing, right? That the systemic inequality, the white supremacy, the patriarchy, the colonialism, not only the historical sort of impact and legacy, but its current manifestations. And so we work at multiple scales, from the very local community level to the national level to the international level. And we actually talk about the issues, not almost like an onion, right? Around the structural manifestations of these, the institutional, the community level, the interpersonal, and even within ourselves, and how we also carry a lot of that, a lot of those isms within ourselves, and that it's a constant challenge and unlearning. So all of that is that we, as a grassroots organizing sector, really try to talk about sort of this moment, right? How are we understanding this moment? Is it the end of the world as we know it, with not only the climate crisis, but the crisis of democracy that we were seeing in our country, but around the world as well. And then the economic crisis, and then the COVID crisis, and then the uprisings that we've been seeing in different parts. And in particular, I can speak to the uprisings that have been happening here, led by the movement for Black Lives, by folks that have been challenging very directly anti-Blackness and white supremacy because of the murder, right? The sort of just complete blatant murder of George Floyd over 6 weeks ago, but that we also see the murder of Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Tony McDade. The list can go on in terms of not only state violence, but also vigilante white supremacist violence. And so it's in that context that we understand the role of racial capitalism, which I would also say it's racial and gendered capitalism. That, it's like the last words that George Floyd said is that he couldn't breathe, right? And I think that racial and gendered capitalism has really put, their knee on our necks, just symbolically and literally. And part of that is that it just has gotten to the stage where exploitation, extraction, discrimination is been normalized, and to the point that almost desensitizing us, right? And that the sole purpose, like Gabby said, in life under this system is to accumulate, profit, to own land, to own people, to own nature, to justify dispossession, to use violence, to destroy anything or anyone that challenges it, and that it gets manifested in so many ways through culture, ideas, behavior, religion, hegemony, and that ultimately, often acts without impunity. And part of what you know, we need to be thinking about is like, how are we then understanding this global system at play in this current moment, and what does it mean to then be in ethical solidarity, knowing that it has different manifestations to different peoples, to different nation states, to different communities, and but that there is something that then is the thing that ties, right? And so in our organization, we have this framing that has a historical sort of acknowledgement that in the United States, there's always been a very deep solidarity movement, right? And that solidarity movement has seen its way manifested in sort of the most reductionist way as charity, right? As sort of like a much more a model of helping people and wanting to do good, right? And usually seen in the context of like giving money, giving resources, highlighting attention to it. And I think that's probably been the most dominant model, right? It's what then sets and establishes philanthropy, what then has done what many sort of religious institutions practice and do. And that it's ultimately like, oh, we have some level of power and privilege, and we have an ability to help. And I think that's something that is very it comes from a good place, but I think it's not sufficient, and in fact many times it's very patronizing and controlling. A much more political articulation is solidarity, and that solidarity has been seen from, you know, from my sort of understanding of history in the US, of like, you know, the Abraham Lincoln brigades of folks that went to fight fascism in Spain, right? Of people who were in solidarity with the civil rights movement, white people in the South going to register people, Black folks, to vote, putting their lives on the line. To the anti-apartheid movement in the 80s, to the anti-intervention movements in Central America, and like the creation of sanctuary cities and sister cities. But solidarity oftentimes was one directional. And in a lot of ways, again, sort of from a context of the global North, or people being able to talk about how are we in support and solidarity with liberation struggles, revolutionary processes. But basically, it's almost like we have to, again, sort of the notion of helping and not necessarily seeing sort of that joint struggle, or not necessarily even seeing the manifestations of those, what people were fighting for in Guatemala or El Salvador or in South Africa, weren't necessarily seeing it in their own communities or in their own country. And so we have adopted that and moved to a different frame, what we call is grassroots internationalism. And grassroots internationalism is really about talking about what is our mutual interest, and that solidarity is actually multi-directional, and that it has to have there is a common sort of not only enemy, that which is those sort of deeper systemic sort of analysis and context and history, but also that we have it's almost like there's a level of interdependence that is like fundamentally a piece of that. That's like, we cannot actually exist without you and you without us, and that ultimately we need each other. And I think that that's very important. There's a level of a way to be able to say, for example, right now, there has been an incredible level of solidarity of international movements with movements in the United States around the uprisings for Black lives. And people understand the need to be able to fight and get Trump out of office, because they see that getting Trump out of office is something that ultimately it will benefit the sort of global reordering of society, not only for the people within the United States, but people around the world. And I think that that notion of grassroots internationalism really takes us to a new way of actually thinking about what does it mean to relate in ways that really respect self-determination, respect agency, respect that highlight the need for us to be not only accompanying each other, but also accomplices, right? And that it does understand that we have to actually change power dynamics, and we actually have to challenge privilege within our context, particularly in the global north. And that ultimately that we as people in the north, or as white people, or middle class people, or people with some level of access to wealth, that we're not necessarily the center, and that we're not necessarily, because our resources or privilege, can make the change. So with that context, I think I want to share a little bit, and I want to figure out how I'm doing on timing, Margo. I want to share a little bit of context. So if we understand this sort of COVID moment that then accelerated and highlighted the impact of white supremacy, patriarchy, and colonialism, and we see the level of impact that it's having, right? It's not the great equalizer. It is the great accelerator of what actually has been wrong with the system, right? And that the responses is not just happens to be that we have an genocidal, narcissist, inept president. It's been that it's been a context of 30, 40 years of neoliberalism that has created the condition that we don't even acknowledge this as a public health crisis and a genocide of peoples, right? And so I think that part of that context is that we have to then understand what is it that we're then trying to do in this moment, right? And what is it that we're trying to sort of provide, I think, as an alternative. And so we have been working on this whole concept.
Cindy, can you slow down? Just slow down a little bit. Interpretation.
Okay.
This
Okay.
is very
Sorry.
good. Just
Okay.
I see you
Okay.
getting excited.
Okay. And then how long do I have, Margo?
Another 5 minutes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Sorry. I do interpretation as well, so sorry. So I think we come from the environmental justice movement, but we also come from the feminist movement and from the racial justice movement. And so one of the political projects, and part of what we're trying to say, is that we desperately need an alternative to racial and gendered capitalism. And what that alternative is really, we understand that we need a just transition, right? That we need a transition to a new economic, political, cultural model, and that what our proposal is a just transition to a regenerative, anti-racist, feminist economy, and that it will have different components that are localized, that are that have different sort of frameworks in terms of what's valued, where we put not only our bodies at the center, but our care, the notions of care and regeneration at the center, and not profit or capital. And that in that sort of framework, that we actually need to be able to think about how we start redefining what's possible. And then I think these last 6 months have shown us that what was impossible to demand, or things that we've been demanding for years and for decades, all of a sudden the barometer of what the common sense and the common good has moved, and people have been radicalized, and what was invisible and marginalized and undervalued and underpaid, such as reproductive labor, all of a sudden becomes the center of what's keeping us alive, and what historically has kept us alive, just to be frank. But it gives us an opportunity to then think about how to be able to push in this moment, right? And how to be able to think about that systemic alternative that we so desperately need and deserve and need and want, to then be able to be the architects of that future at this moment. So that's one of the challenges, I think, of this moment, is because there's been this massive radicalization, and there's now this counter push to like go back to normal, reopen the economy, deal with the, sort of this fight over, mask our tyranny, here in the United States, led by a lot of the white supremacists. And so part of what we actually need to think about is how do we begin to keep pushing? And then the uprisings around Movement for Black Lives has also shown us we have to actually abolish the police state, right? We have to actually stop the killing of Black bodies and peoples and nations. And I think that part of what I think is really, really important is that this moment has unmasked all of this. There has been an X-ray, like all of us can see things very clearly now. And the question is, what is it that we do, right? And so how do we actually then, in that context, redefine what safety is, redefine what security is, say what needs to be divested from, who gets a say, right? Who has who are then the real experts in what's needed at this moment. And I think that in that context, so many movements from around the world have been putting forward those are alternatives. You talked about food sovereignty. We talked about sort of women at the peace tables. We talk about just like the radical imagination that I think so many of us have been working on, is like now is the moment to put those into place. So with that, I'm going to just close with saying, I think there's 4 things that I think we have to really think about in this moment. I think that there is a tension to think about, part of the neoliberal system is really about thinking about individuals and individualism. And then in this context, nationalism, right? Sort of like we have to then think about our own boundaries and our own borders and our own country. And I think that sort of response, it has to be countered with interdependence, with collectivity, with collective care, with internationalism, and to be able to say very boldly and very clearly that grassroots solidarity is part of our solution, right? That we're not going to get out of this mess without each other. And I think that that's very fundamental as a sort of a demand, but also a set of like values that I think we need to be talking and putting out there widely. The second thing is that this whole push to normalize and go back to normal, I think we have to challenge that, full frontally challenge that, because what we know is that there's certain peoples that will be disposable, certain nations that will be disposable, and that is then very racialized and gendered. And I think that we cannot throw anyone under the bus, and no one, we need to stand. Like, so for example, this whole push in the United States to reopen the schools, we know that teachers, janitors, people who maintain bus drivers, children, they're not disposable. And I think that part of that is we have to stand and say no to those kind of things, right? And we have to reimagine what that radical solidarity looks like, and what that putting yourself on the line, even in the pandemic, people going out and protesting and being in the streets, that people were willing to take that risk and that solidarity because it was so much more important to be out in the streets in this moment. The third piece is that there's going to be reformist or incremental sort of solutions to these colliding crises. And we see them happening. And even people in the left and people in the movement are putting forward those incremental moves. And I think that it is a moment for transformative, visionary demands and solutions, and putting front and center what will really actually deal with the problems that we know are going to actually work, right? And then number 4 in this moment is like, who gets listened to, right? Who gets listened to, and who and I think that question to me is about what kind of leadership and leaderful movement that we have been trying to create, and like that that it's also radical leadership, and that we do have to challenge race and gender essentialism, because just because you're a woman, or just because you're Latina, or because you're Black, that you then fully adopt that. No, we have to be much more rigorous. It's about the politics and the practice that align with our values and our vision. And that ultimately, but it is important that in this ethical solidarity, that there has to be a way in which we do challenge what has been historically known as, who gets listened to and who are seen as leaders. And really the importance of Black people, Indigenous people, anti-racist white people, people in the global South, etc., young people. And I think that's going to be something that's going to be really important. And so I would say those are the sort of 4 kind of invitations and challenges to us as we really think about this moment and where do we go from here, as we think about ethical solidarity with each other, but also what kind of world are we basically fighting for and laying the groundwork for. So thank you.
Wow, Cindy, you gave us a lot to think about, and I'm glad it's all recorded. But just picking up on this idea of, grassroots, multidimensional grassroots internationalism, and this whole question of interdependence. And I think we'll come back to that. Thank you so much. It was breathtaking. Ariel, now over to you. Oh, I'm sorry, Kozue. Kozue has been the president of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, based in Switzerland, but with branches all over the world. And she is professor at Doshisha University in Kyoto. And she's, I would say, one of the strongest feminist anti-militarist activists in Japan, and very much in solidarity with the women in Okinawa. And so thank you so much, Kozue, and please go ahead.
Thank you, Margo, and thank you everyone at the South-South Forum for this opportunity, and tech people, and of course interpreters. I have done a lot of interpretation between Japanese and English, and Margo knows how annoying I can be sometimes, or probably most of the times, to tell speakers, particularly English speakers, to slow down or do not use colloquial expressions and so forth. And now I am being interpreted. I'm not sure if I can follow what I have told everyone, but I will try. But I am very thankful for the session is being interpreted into other language. I am also very grateful for this session, among others in this series, that specifically addresses this question of responsibility of women in the global North. I am, what Margo mentioned earlier, first Japan as being I think it's a unique. Japan occupies a unique place in this discussion or a framework of global North and global South. I am Japanese. I'm ethnic Japanese. I was born and grew up in Japan. And when I lived in the US as a graduate student, I think for the first time, I experienced more racial racialized attitudes by the others. But most of my life in Japan, I have been in the position of the most privileged in the society, and it is from that perspective that I have worked with the women in Okinawa and others in the region, Northeast Asia. And I prepared this one-page PowerPoint because when I talk about what I have done or what I do, the context is often the U.S. mainly because of the language, particularly when I do this in English. The context is in the U.S. or Europe and other places where people are not really familiar with where Okinawa is and why there are many U.S. military bases in Okinawa. So I prepared this one-page PowerPoint, but I realized that there are many people from Northeast Asia and East Asia, so I may not have, I didn't really have to prepare that, but maybe that would help you to have the image what people in Okinawa have lived under colonialism and militarism. I think we are in this region, Northeast Asia, still at a critical juncture. The COVID-19 has shown many many problems of our society. It also show, I think, some possibilities of change. But after a few months, what I am feeling, what is being manifested more clearly is that intensifying militarism and colonialism. And in my work with the women in Okinawa, militarism has the same root with sexism and misogyny, and that is also being reinforced. And I feel that we in a global North have so much to do now. I would like to make sure that the framework of global North and South does not exclusively apply to nation-to-nation relations. I'm sure you are aware. My concern and the responsibilities that I felt more strongly, was Japanese women's, mainland Japanese women's responsibility in the continuation of this colonial militarized situation in Okinawa, and even today. I just got the news alert. I was as I was waiting for as I was putting another internet website on, and we started to see COVID infections on the U.S. military bases in Okinawa, and that's it. And Japan has been doing much better than other countries, probably, in terms of not in Asia, but compared to the United States and other European countries. More precisely, Japan is not the best one, or we are actually the worst, one of the worst ones in Asia. So that has to be acknowledged. However, we started to realize that the U.S. military personnel have been probably carrying infections from the United States, and they have landed in Okinawa. And as you can see, Okinawa is a small island, and this also reflected. This is also a reflection of militarization and colonialism that the people of Okinawa have been placed under. Their medical infrastructure is poorer, and they have been trying very hard to contain COVID infection on their island. They almost closed their island, but of course it's the US military who has free access, no quarantine or whatsoever, no examination, no way for us to know the conditions of US military, and that's been manifested now for the past few days. They have more than 30 infections today. Yesterday it was more about 70 and so forth. So this is clear situation of COVID-19 on a militarized colonized area in Okinawa. And of course I accuse US military and the US government. They need to be held accountable for that. But also it's the Japanese government and the mainland Japanese population who let this happen. And the Japanese government and we citizens in Japan have not done enough to hold our government responsible to even receive decent information on COVID-19 on U.S. military bases within U.S. military, and give that information to local authorities. So that is the reality in COVID-19 and North and South issue within the country, within Japan. Margo introduced International Women's Network Against Militarism. So this is something that I would like to introduce today as example, I would hope, of transnational feminist solidarity network with grassroots women's organizing in Okinawa, South Korea, the Philippines, mainland Japan, continental US, Guam, Hawaii, Puerto Rico. We had some friends in Australia and other Pacific Islands. We're trying to be more closely connected with the Pacific Islands as well. The network, my understanding is that the network has been around for over 20 years, and we started to we've been foraging the solidarity that across the north and south in a more complicated manner. Our focus has been on achieving gender equality and assuring dignity of all these women and the children living in host communities of the U.S. military in those areas, because by examining or even learning their experiences, women and children's experiences in host communities of U.S. military bases, have shown the deep contradiction or deep problem of the militarized security, militarized state-centered security. One of them was continuing sexual violence, including sex industry and human trafficking around the bases. But there have been sexual assault cases in those areas. Okinawan women have compiled a chronology of the sexual crime because and that also happened 25 years ago. They started to compile chronology so that something that had been hidden in a history or even people's public memory can be visible. And even and not a single year passed by even since then without sexual violence by U.S. soldiers on women and children in Okinawa. When military is stationed, and the rationale we are told about the presence of the military is to assure security. And when people's lives are made insecure by the very, very presence of the military, I think it's a natural question. So what is security, and whose security, and who decides? We have been posing this question for many years, and still we live in this basic framework of militarized state-centered security, which shares the same root of sexism and misogyny. And those locations where the U.S. militaries and other militaries have been, were the areas that were colonized by what is now global North. Another a little more probably specific political actions that I have been involved is a feminist peace movement to end the Korean War. Margo, Cindy, Kimchi were at the meeting a few years ago in Seoul, South Korea, and Women Christie MD, now US-based organization, has been leading a campaign to end the Korean War by assuring women's meaningful participation, which is now called Korea Peace Now. In this region, and I would be very happy to learn about participants later, particularly from this region, Northeast Asia region. We still live in the Cold War values, and Cold War was not a problem for the Cold War is the time when warfare was not conducted, and that was the case in Europe and the United States. In other areas, the Cold War era was the time when lower level actual conflicts were waged in many places for independence or decolonization. In this region, the Korean Peninsula was divided by two, and the Japan as a colonizer of Korean Peninsula and other parts of the Northeast Asia, of course, was responsible, and U.S. and other superpowers are also, of course, responsible in dividing Korean Peninsula and leave that conflict as it is for 70 years. And this and global north in this region, global north in this region, Japan, namely, was able to become a part of their global north because of the actual armed conflict. And coming back to the responsibility of women in the global north, and I'm very keen about the responsibilities of ethical and political, and in many ways, responsibilities of Japanese women, women's movement, women's peace movement, even, that did not enough to end the war on the Korean Peninsula. And not only that, we were benefited from that. We made profit from that conflict and became one of the leading economies of the world. I also have to talk very briefly about the responsibilities of the people in Japan about racism against Koreans living in Japan. That has colonial the problem has its roots in the colonial rule of the people of the Korean Peninsula, and of course other regions in Northeast Asia, Taiwan, Hong Kong are also part of that, which I'm not. I don't have enough expertise to discuss. So I would like to hear from the participants of this session. That the people, the Koreans in Japan, or people with Korean roots living in Japan, third, fourth, fifth generations even, are still a target of physical hate crimes, and I have and that has not been the central issue in Japan, and this is a concrete example of the problem of the global north, the Japan as a global north, and I hope I can discuss with others more conceptually, something that I shared. Thank you very much.
Your comments really raise this very important question of, how does a country considered South at one point become North, right? And the whole process. And in the case of Japan, it was a kind of a war-based economy and so forth, and other ways as well, right? The involvement in wars. The other question, and also reminder is that, Japan has been an imperial power in Southeast Asia, right? Was an imperial power for many years, and we can talk about that in a different way a little bit later. So thank you very much for giving us your insights. Now we will hear from Ariel SALLEH. Ariel is a longtime activist, author, and sociologist in the Department of Political Economy at the University of Sydney. Former associate professor in social ecology at UWS. She has lectured widely, including in New York, Manila, and Toronto, and she is a recent research fellow at the Friedrich Schiller Universität Jena and visiting professor at Nelson Mandela University. Welcome, Ariel, and we're looking forward to hearing from you.
So I organized my thoughts around your themes of landscape, yearning, doing, and so on. And where else to start, of course, but with the corona crisis, which is part of the Anthropocene. And in this dying Eurocentric civilization, which I really think it is, the means to life has simply swallowed up the ends. The pandemic is making, and the good part is, the pandemic is making the productivist economic sector give way to the biosocial reproductive sector. Everywhere now, the conversation is about giving care for each other, children, elderly, caring for nature. The skillful regenerative labour of nurses, teachers, mothers, peasant farmers and gatherers is finally getting acknowledgement. The old idea of human mastery over nature is hollowing out. People starting to see how the global capitalist patriarchal culture was a fraud. Still, the ruling classes try to maintain a semblance of state management, rushing to install the latest digital fix in big data network technology. This is expected to help the corporate economic agenda back on its feet. Big Pharma, likewise, is looking to profit from mandatory mass vaccination across continents. Medicalised population control may even be a sidekick. Yearning. The West's fantasy of humanity as standing over and above nature was always a very faulty ontology. This ancient form of patriarchal othering originated with a symbolic mother killing, meant to enable men to birth themselves without limits and dependency on natural flows. As I watch the current epidemic of femicide across the globe, my yearning is that all societies can come to own up and to deal with this deep structural dynamic that shapes our globally dominant institutions. Feminists already show how it's possible to throw off old sex-gender roles and attitudes. My yearning is to name and heal the destructive masculinist psychology of othering that has fueled centuries of violence on women's bodies, black bodies, children's bodies, animal bodies, and living nature at large. Imagining. The mirror image of othering is holding. And I so love this word. It reflects the originary moment of identity formation for each one of us in a mother's arms. Holding also speaks our human indebtedness in natural embeddedness, in natural processes. If we can think of ourselves as simply nature in embodied form, we start to see how all life on earth is related to everything else. Like the song, round like a circle in a spiral, like a wheel within a wheel, never ending or beginning like an ever spinning reel. Both the political right and left have assumed that labour is about transforming nature into something else, something man-made, something having value. But the kind of labour that I describe as holding is reproductive. It protects the integrity of natural relations. Holding labour can be seen in the nurture of children, the regeneration of gardens, the preservation of streams, all precautionary, life-affirming work. Doing. Some say the corona outbreak is a ploy of the global elite to put in place the conditions for total control of ravaged populations as a pliable resource for the new capitalism. There's no doubt the global economic system was already in freefall last year before the pandemic got underway. At the same time, this crisis is bringing a revolutionary energies to the surface as people begin to prioritise reproductive values. Right now, in my country, Australians are protesting on the streets for dozens of life-affirming causes. Black deaths in custody, our own. women against domestic violence, child sexual abuse in the church, and many kinds of animal liberation. And after a summer of climate change caused bushfires across an area the size of France, we struggled to stop urban electromagnetic pollution, rivers dying from irrigator theft, land clearing, coal seam gas mines, and nuclear waste dumping. This myriad of peoples, groups for life on Earth, are society-wide, people working in common. But leadership shown by Indigenous communities and student girls is especially inspiring, not to mention a way out bunch of women called the Knitting Nanas. At multilateral summits, the other experience of caregivers, small farmers, First Nation peoples has always been treated as cultural, not economic. This keeps their experienced provisioning skills outside the white middle-class masculinist government and UN agency discourse. But since the Seattle People's Caucus in '99, such conventional wisdom has been dual-powered by initiatives like the World Social Forum, Indigenous Environment Network, Via Campesina, Extinction Rebellion, and of course, our own Global U. Our book, Pluriverse, a post-development dictionary, has opened up into a global tapestry of alternatives, fostering new conversations between political visions from Swaraj, ecofeminism, Ubuntu, degrowth, and others. No more tech fixes and so-called free trade zones. In the futures we create, the global will be local, rebuilding autonomous, eco-sufficient, bioregional livelihoods, respectful of ecological limits. Activist sisters in the Global South have a head start in these skills. To paraphrase the late great Chilean economist Manfred Max Neef, self-managed eco-cultures are synergistic. They satisfy many needs at once. They're not only environmentally benign, but creatively social. Besides subsistence, they foster learning, participation, innovation, ritual, identity, and belonging. A high quality of life can be enjoyed on 3 hours work a day. By contrast, the engineered satisfiers of urban industrial societies like cars, computers, bureaucracies cost much energy and time, sabotaging the very convenience they were designed for. My dream for doing is that from this meeting today, we will set in place a discussion to form a Women's Security Council to dual power, expose and guide the UN body as its floundering old-time patriarchal realpolitik continually pushes life on Earth to the brink. In this doing, we need to balance 3 interweaving goals: ecological sustainability, protecting nature's metabolic value and the interdependency of species; socio-economic justice, protecting the well-being of sex, genders, ethnicities, generations, and the sovereignty of bioregional livelihoods; cultural autonomy, protecting difference and the rich historical diversity of lifeways. Our future will be post-capitalist, post-colonial, post-patriarchal, and ecocentric. Once people around the world can sense themselves as nature in embodied form, then cross-cultural understanding and peace on Earth will grow. That's it.
Thank you very much. Wow, let's give all of our speakers just a great round of applause, as we can do on Zoom. Feel free to chat, post comments in the chat box. And when you do, make sure you send your comments to the category that says all panelists and attendees, so that we can hear what you have to say or read what you have to say. Before we go on, though, I'd like us just to take a few moments, and I invite you to think about the points that our panelists made, right? And really try to understand what they said and what they meant, you know, to the best, in the best ways you can. And if you and among the participants are connected to the north, right? One of the questions is, to whom are we responsible, and or to whom are we accountable, and for what should we be responsible in very practical terms? And if you are connected to countries of the global south, right? What would you like to see, you know, from us in terms of solidarities and so forth? And Cindy made a very important point that ethical solidarity is actually mutual, right? So what would be the give and take, as it were? And I don't mean that in an instrumental sense, right? But what would be the reciprocity? What kinds of things would be going around between us that would make us truly reciprocal and in a mutuality, in a relationships of mutuality? So just kind of sit with what you heard, right? And make notes to yourself and take time to think about your questions. And then we will have a short Q&A session, and then I'd like to invite Carla also to jump into this conversation. She's one of us at the Peace Women Across the Globe. And until someone does, I have a question for the panelists, right? Cindy talked about this question of radical and feminist leadership, right? What would that look like if we take seriously that we're in an ethical solidarity, you know, position, right? So that's one question. And just to push all the panelists a little bit, right, is what must we be doing in relation to the nation states and the corporations that are wreaking havoc, you know, around the world, as well as in our own locations, right? So far, a lot of the conversation was relating to how to think about our relationships to our activist counterparts or academic counterparts in different parts of the world. So that's another kind of question. And anybody can take that up.
Just the list of what's happening in Australia on the Australian streets at the moment is in every issue there. There's a contestation of corporate power and state complicity. So the issues are as wide as the rainbow. I think we just have to keep telling them how we see it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, something I've been thinking about also is capitalism. You know, there's been a lot of conversation, especially in the South-South Forum, the main section, that, you know, we're seeing the end of capitalism and all of those things, right? That's been a pretty strong theme. And it may not happen soon, but it's going to happen, right? And one of the questions I was thinking about is, you know, what are the investments, even of people who are not in positions of power, to keep the system going? In other words, what are some of the kind of material yearnings, right, of people who would say, oh, you know, capitalism, you know, isn't great, but, you know, I'm going to get what I want, right? And I've seen it in different parts of the world, right? And so how do we think about people's yearnings, right, that then attach themselves to systems that are actually not good for them. So that's something. And then the other thing I was thinking about is when we, get to this new world, right, that we're trying to create, what kinds of persons do we have to be able to live in them and not mess it up, right? So what's the transformative part of the organizing work that we should be engaged in, right, as we're creating new structures and new systems? What's the personal collective transformation of consciousness, of decolonizing our hearts, so to speak? Anybody please jump in.
Well, what bothers me about the question a little bit, Margo, is that in a sense it essentializes us, we, all humans together. Whereas one of the things I was trying to pull out in my paper was that the society we're living in, as we all know, is deeply sex-gendered. The cultural institutions are permeated with this ancient culture, and it is embodied, literally embodied, in those who are given entitlement in that culture. So there's a huge psychological process of awareness making that is going to have to go on, because it's not enough just to do politics and to change. Exactly. Politics won't change. The institutions won't change until the deep roots of that culture are exposed. That's my feeling.
Exactly. And that's what I'm trying to get to, right? How do we deal with that piece of it as we're trying to create new institutions and structures? That's precisely my question. And what kind of human beings do we have to become, right? And especially specific to this topic, that we're in relationship to these locations that yield or wield an enormous amount of power, right? And we benefit, as Kozue said, we benefit whether we embrace that state, whether we embrace the corporation or not. We benefit from it, particularly in material terms. So yeah, let's get the conversation going, and anybody now can just jump in. And then maybe the thing to do is to, Carla, why don't you go ahead with your comments?
Sure. Yeah, and I was just thinking of one of my own experiences with, like, in terms of this kind of transformative moment maybe that you're talking about, or like how we need to transform as humans, in terms of kind of realizing and really letting it sink in to me personally how, for example, clothes are produced, and how these kind of global chains that are very much a feminist issue, I think, how they are set up and how I benefit from it and how others are really suffering from it. And I really could see a transformation in myself in the last years, that by now I kind of feel that it's become kind of my own pain a little bit, that I don't want to contribute to this system anymore. Just like a little response maybe to what we said before, but that's not my actual comment on this session. So I'm really glad actually that this session is happening today, because the question of responsibility of Global North feminists is one of my main questions that I have at the moment as I'm entering kind of professional life. I graduated from university last year and started working at Peace Women across the globe after that. And I'm really glad that I landed at that organization, because I'm surrounded by colleagues and this incredible network of feminists, of peace activists around the world, that I feel we can really discuss this question together, or these questions that arise with this. And I think that is almost one of the main things that we have the responsibility to do at the moment, is to finding a balance to when to speak, when to speak about things and when to listen. And I feel like I've come to a really good place to do that together, because it's very hard to do it on your own, and it's not the point to sit in your room and like just come up with an idea, but to actually exchange about it, ask the really hard question of what is my place in this? Do I have a is it important? Is it maybe time for me to listen to my friends or to my fellow feminists from other places? And I think, of course, the baseline of all of this is the discussion of privilege, and to realizing your own place or your own privileges that you have first, and what to do with it. And with this, I found it really interesting how this changed a bit when I started working and were not a student anymore. Of course, as a student in an international master, privilege is very present. And of course, it's very obvious, be it physical things like who can easily go on an exchange and who has to apply for a ton of visas, or also in discussions who's really loud and confident and who maybe gets shut down by the group. But what I found really different is when money enters these relationships, and when you, as an organization, have this kind of privilege, because I feel like once money enters relationship, it tends to cement certain structures, such as privilege structures. So yes, at Peace Women Across the Globe, we try to really stay open to these issues, and we try to really create spaces where we can talk about these difficult situations that occur, of course, if you work with different countries or different organizations. And one thing that I find very amazing to experience at the moment is how, of course, solidarity is really, really powerful, and solidarity in a sense of maybe creating or holding spaces, for example, for emotional support for each other. And I think that is really like a reciprocity. What's the word? Reciprocity? No, that's where it's like a very not one way, like not in one direction, but it's like emotional support for each other. If you know what I mean. Sorry, I'm lacking the word in English right now. Yeah, so this is what we're talking a lot about, how we can create spaces that are contrary to this individualized notion of neoliberalism, but more like community care spaces. And we have had very, very powerful and emotional moments where, for example, one young feminist was getting very sad and started crying about how social leaders in her country are being killed every day. And another much more experienced activist from a different country was comforting her, and we were all kind of holding the space together. So these are really beautiful moments that we experience, and that encourage me and us to find ways together and I would love to keep this discussion going that we are starting or having today, to find ways of ethical solidarity. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Carla, for bringing in the kind of what I'm thinking about as the kind of the micro politics, sort of our individual practices and the places we find ourselves and the kinds of conversations, we're having as we're trying to create the other kinds of changes at the other levels. And, there's a question here in the chat, and I want, it would be good to address that question. And then I also want to take this conversation in a slightly different direction than was originally planned. But let's answer this question in the chat first. Ariel, can you explain about the economic justice interconnection with gender capability aspect in different country, example, cultural relativism? What I'm understanding the person asking is the economic justice interconnections with gender capability, right? And I'm not sure what's meant by gender capability, but let me just infer that maybe the question has to do with how do we think about economic justice in relation to not just gender roles, but actual capacities, around being women, for example, and how do we think about cultural relativism, especially in these solidarity movements, where we say, well, we can't say this because that's their cultural way of being or something like that. That's what I'm understanding from the question.
Beautiful things that, I've spent a long decades looking at ecological politics. And one of the beautiful things is when we get to a point when we can admit that we are nature in embodied form ourselves, then we can start to look at different kinds of economics. And the economics that I'm interested in the future global society are livelihoods, which, as I said in the short presentation, livelihoods which are based in autonomous bioregions. People are committed in their community together to protecting the environment they live in and provisioning themselves from it. And men and women can have provisioning skills, and they do. We see that across many cultures. These are cultures outside of capitalism. These are cultures in the periphery of capitalism. But nevertheless, they are cultures and economies which fundamentally sustain the conditions for capitalism to go on, simply by protecting ecosystems, protecting forests and water supplies and so on. So the language seems to come from a paradigm which is difficult for me to engage with because it's very, perhaps it's very much touched by liberal feminist assumptions, I think. I may be wrong. Maybe we need to go deeper.
And just what I'm also struck by right now in our own session is, the dominance of English, right? The whole thing is being conducted with English as the, as the dominant language, and how that English capacity, right? English speaking capacity has also so much to do with this question of power, right? And the issue that was raised about who gets listened to, who is thought to be knowledgeable, right? And so if we take English just literally and metaphorically to think about power, how do we complicate our understandings of power, right? And we can see it right now. Carla said, I'm not sure how to say it in English, right? And so what are the ways that we as feminists need to think about this question of power, right? And
somebody just sent in a comment. I don't know whether was it Tung Yi just had a comment on that. I noticed.
The person who asked the question to you said thank you for your answer. And then another question came in about raising a language as a domination of power in many conversations. So perhaps, you know, perhaps we need to really go a little bit deep in thinking about power here. And this might be a good place to begin. And we have Gabi here who hasn't spoken beyond her own presentation. Is there something you'd like to respond to, Gabi?
I come back to the language. I feel if English is a dominant language, and sometimes I can speak very well in German and French and in other languages, but if I have to speak in English, I feel sometimes like in a prison. Mm-hmm. So this domination is not only is for all of us who are speaking another language. Yes. Is very lähmend, Carla. Was heißt lähmend?
Paralyzing.
Paralyzing. Mm-hmm. And it cuts me from you. It is a cut, but I understand very well, but to speak is difficult, and this is really complex to if we are in a network, to speak with grassroots women or to have a relationship with grassroots women in the south or also in the north. This makes the situation, the understanding, not the solidarity, but the understanding very difficult. And I think this domination is a very important issue. And if you have translation, the translation is okay, but the translation is also another language. So I think this is this can be obstacle for understanding, and what is our language of the heart to discuss together. I think this we have to feel to feel what happens and what are the problems and what are the discussions. Mm-hmm. So English against or with the language with heart, but is a combination I think could be good for us.
Yes, and I'm thinking as you're speaking, Gabi, that just taking the example of English dominance really complicates also the North and South, right? So we could say that people in the North, in English-speaking countries, like the US, of course, Australia, New Zealand, England, right? The South and the North, if they have English language capacity, it gives a certain kind of leverage in these transnational conversations, right? Where English is dominant, right? And also in the South, you know, if you have the English language capacity, right? It also gives a certain kind of power and leverage. And so if we think not just literally about English, but about power, what are the axes of power that we need to think about when we're talking about ethical solidarities? And obviously language is one of them, right? Are there other things that we may take for granted, right, that this would be a good time to really look at?
I think I just wanted to jump into what Gabi was saying. I think I was reflecting also yesterday when we talked about the speech about militarization, and then I realized that there are some words which are really becoming kind of a simplifying concepts. We're just using these English words because everybody uses them, and we know that's like kind of a Franca language. So it's a reductionist way to use certain very complex concepts, actually. And I feel sad and bad also in myself reducing the complexity of things like militarization. What does it really mean? But we just use it like that because we don't have enough words to explain it deeply when we talk in English. That's one thing. And the other thing is, I think it's really a way of de-emotionalizing our thinking. I remember just a small example. I talked once to my son in Turkish, and my husband, he speaks Turkish to him. And then he told me, he was about 4 years old, "Mommy, don't talk Turkish to me. That's not your language." And that's really, it's about 30 years ago. But still, I'm hanging on that because, you know, I think it's also, you're not communicated as yourself. You're communicated in kind of a box. You're kind of a box speaker. So I think this is really, but I don't know how to break that up.
So another axis of power that someone, Gwyn Kirk, one of our network members, has raised here is the power that complicates ethical solidarities, unequal access to money and fundraising. So would anyone want to comment about that? I think that's also a very important point here. Would anybody want to comment about the economics of ethical solidarities?
To have
Yes,
the money in the north is a suffering for us. Sometimes it's not, it's very good to have money and to support projects and to support campaigns and so on, and to have money. But sometimes it is also a suffering. It is an exclusion to speak the same language, not English or French or other thing, but the same language in issues. We cannot, the power is, where is the money?
Mm-hmm.
And when we speak in our general office in Bern, we also have behind the head, we and they. Mm-hmm. How to support this project with our money. It is very complicated. Money complicates the relationship, but we need the money to realize projects in the north, in the south, to organize peace tables also, and so on. But we always are in the situation to make the organizations which we work, to make them small. Mm-hmm. It's complicated to explain. Mm-hmm. It is always a difference between us, we have the money, and you need the money to realize feminist projects and peace projects and so on. And with this difference and with this Spannungsbogen, Annemarie.
Anne-Marie, can you just translate or interpret?
It's a tension.
Tension
between. Yes, like in a you are in a hierarchical relationship. Yes, exactly. We as givers and then as takers, and a kind of a dependency you're creating with having money in the north, exactly. And the people in the south needing this money. So.
And we discuss it a lot, and we are conscient, but we cannot verhinderen.
Prevent.
We cannot prevent this tension
mm-hmm.
between us and them.
Right, and another complication to that tension is that wealth, in the north is generated by exploiting resources in the South, right? And so
Yes.
we're absolutely caught, around this question of money. Thank you, Gwen, for raising that. Cindy, did you want to respond to this question as well?
So part of our response to the question of power and language and then dominance of language is really about how do we think about an approach around language justice, right? So in the context of the United States, that is very diverse, and it's like there could be, I think that, what do they say in the Bronx? There's like the most languages spoken in the world in the Bronx, like 150 languages. Sort of, I think that there has to be some principles and some protocols, and I think a culture of actually being patient and uncomfortable, right? And I think that part of that context is that there has to be practices within our organizations and then movements about what does it mean to actually have sort of a commitment to people speaking in their own language, because it's not only body language. Some of us talk a lot with our hands. It's body language. It's tone. It's sort of how we speak, but it's also the emotion, right? Like how are you actually saying it? And so I always say that the job of the interpreters and the translators is actually very, in doing movement work internationally, it's actually so critical, because what words get chosen, how does it politically align, what gender, how are they then sort of expressing sort of different ways in which different expressions get interpreted and translated. I think it's all political, and it's all very personal, and how you hear it and how it gets delivered, it's all important. And so, for example, in our organization, we've been going through a very deep process around what does it mean to actually uphold the values of language justice and incorporate it into everything we do, from how things get written to how they to the trainings that we have, and that we also take into account literacy, right? Literacy, and that we also take into account the digital divide. And I think this moment of the pandemic has also sort of shown those class distinctions, right? In terms of who has access to things like spaces and accesses to technology and internet and tablets and computers and all of that, right? I think a lot of people have also talked about disability justice, and what does it also mean to take in for us to think about how to incorporate that. So I think it's a constant challenge in ways and tools and processes and politics that we have to incorporate, so that then I think people can feel welcomed and incorporated and seen and viewed, right? So when you come to this question, Margo, about like sort of leadership, right? Like what does that look like? And I think that's what we have to challenge. It's like if we're in majority white spaces or majority spaces that are cisgendered men, or spaces that are older, I think there has to be an interrogation about why that keeps happening, and it can't be just like, oh, they're not going to come, or they don't want to come. There has to be sort of, what are the things that we're not doing, and what are the things that we could be doing that then actually creates conditions for people to feel welcomed and seen and in that context. So again, it's not easy, because resources and time, and it actually has to be incorporated into the organizing model, right? So that then actually we're having to have that, and that people need to see themselves in the leaders, in the spokespeople, in who's running meetings as well, not from a place of tokenization, but from a place of authentic sort of authenticity and connection. So the question around resources, I think we can spend a whole conversation around this question, because I think that goes back to what I started with. It's like we've had a model of charity and philanthropy to actually deal with what capitalism, what capitalism stole. It's our wealth, actually. It's people's wealth. It's what people like, you know, it's like the philanthropic institutions and people's wealth has been generated on the exploitation of people and nature, and that has been stolen, and that it continues to be. And I think that we have to be clear that ultimately we do want to do away actually with philanthropy. We actually have to have a plan that actually begins to undo that whole system, because I think it perpetuates the weakness. It makes up for the weaknesses of the state as we know it. And oftentimes it's charity to sort of do some kind of remediation of issues, but it's actually not reparations. And I think that we have to be able to think about that there is a serious demand around reparations of historic harm and current harm, and that philanthropy actually has a huge role, and people of wealth have a huge role in actually being able to, part of actually coming back to what kind of economy we want, is that there has to be some level of redistribution of that wealth and reparations to peoples and nations that were were impacted. And so I think that in the context of the nonprofit industrial complex, and I think that we see there's been so many studies done about like organizations that are led by women, or that are led by women of color, or that are led by people of the global south. There's an unequal distribution. So all those hierarchies get replicated within philanthropy, and then how money actually gets redistributed. There's a lot of conversations about expectations of like a woman of color, for example, director, and sort of what we have to do to prove ourselves to be worthy of then being able to get this money. And that only gets, it gets 100 times if you're from the global south. And so I just think that those are the kind of things that I think we have to challenge and we have to push. And there's been a lot of strategies and a lot of work to try to have accountability within the philanthropic sector. And there has to be this view, we have to have a vision that that sector actually has to abolish itself. and so we've been doing a lot of that work within sections of the ruling class. That, you know,
I want to just add another piece to this conversation about donors, because you're speaking more kind of at the NGO level, right, and organizational level. Let's talk, you know, at a more international level. I'm thinking about places like Palestine, or Palestine in particular, where that country is absolutely donor driven, right? And the ways in which, Swiss Peace is there, Swiss Development Corporation, USAID, but the moment that the countries decide, they're no longer going to give money to Palestine, then the whole economy collapses, right? That's one part of it. Another part of it is the ways in which the donor, the presence of the donors is also contributing to distorting the economy of a particular location. So for example, in Ramallah, which is the capital of the West Bank, basically, where the Palestinian National Authority exists, right? The price of a cup of coffee is the same price, that you would pay in New York City, thanks to the presence of international NGOs and international donors. So, there's a whole nother piece to the funding question that Gwyn raised, to us, right? And the distortion of economies that are dependent distortion of particular sectors of the economy in particular countries. And they're usually urban areas because that's where the donors, establish offices and things like that. And there's another piece of that, which is that when international donor organizations or international NGOs go into a place, there's also kind of a brain drain that happens, right? And I've seen it so much in Palestine, where the international NGOs pay much better than local NGOs, right? Or the PNA, if you're doing civil service. So there's a whole nother level of this question around money and finances that I think it's important to think about here as well. Kozue, do you want to jump into this conversation? And Japan
Sure.
has the JICA, right? That goes around to different places.
The question about resources and languages and power. For the theme of this session, maybe can we formulate a question? So what can we women in the global north, what are we prepared to give up? I think it's a real question to us. And I think I think Margo, you're trying to bring us to think about what we do in our everyday life. We've discussed a lot about concepts, ideas, isms, and so forth, analysis, and your huge question about what the transformative future looks like. And I think a series of questions should be asked to each one of us. In language, for example, English speakers, would you give up your time to that you dominate when you speak in English? When we translators, interpreters ask for at the time to stop and pause and for translation. So would you give up that that space and time? Those of our what we have, resource. So what needs to be a different form? I suppose different format of questions. Are we prepared to do this, or what should we do this, and in what ways? But in one way or another, I think we something like giving up.
And also, then what would we have to gain, right? And is it a zero sum?
Who needs to gain? I think it's not like zero sum game,
right? Okay,
but
great.
Our understanding is that I think you picked up my term, you benefited. So we benefit, those of us who benefited, not only money, but benefited from, say, the Korean War, and the people in the Korean Peninsula still struggle.
Right.
So
exactly.
that sense.
Exactly. Kimchi, please come in.
Yes, well, thank you. Thank you to the speakers. And I echo what Cindy and Margo just said. I think if we look at the question of philanthropy, then, for example, in Hong Kong, the biggest private philanthropy givers are the real estate developers. So you see all their names on the building blocks of the universities. You have the Jockey Club, the Royal Jockey Club that became the Hong Kong Jockey Club, and of course all those people who are running all these casinos in Macau. But then I feel that it's very important, the point that both Margo and Cindy just made, that we have to see, to go beyond just the recent 20 years, 30 years. But then if we go back 200 years or 300 years, so we will have to see how all this land and even the people and all the so-called resources have been plundered and exploited by the current global north. And then now, after all these years, then they give a little peanuts back to the global south or to the poor in their own countries. So I feel that if we do not historicize this relationship, it's so difficult, because then people will actually, a lot of people I know, they feel good because then they're giving away money. And so there's no going back to all the history of the plunder. So I feel that it is not only the question of the current global north, the so-called advanced countries, who are actually the more barbaric countries, if you look at it in another way, to be having all these genocides and plunders, and then come to the current wealth, so to speak. But then it's also the question of for example, the cities dominating the countryside. And so the peasantry, for example, if I take, for example, the case of China, the whole, the reason why China has been able to industrialize in the first 3 decades after 1949 is because about 80% of that so-called accumulation had been taken from the countryside. They have been the sacrifice of the peasants through the forms of this exchange, the value in exchange between agricultural and industrial goods through now and then after 1980. Then there's the peasantry, we now have, I think, over 300 million migrant workers from the countryside coming to the cities to replace the working classes there and continue to contribute their labor. So how is it that we can have all these $1 goods all around, so-called dumping all the markets in the world, but then we enjoy these cheap products, and then we also demonize China for unfair trade. It is indeed unfair because there's all the resources, the contamination, environmental, ecological, and economic resources that had gone into these 100 yen or $1 products. And so I feel that on the question, I think it's not only and if we look at the question of gender, it's also much the same situation if we look at it that way. So I feel that there is a link to see how this racialized capitalism is also what our speakers first said, gendered capitalism, and we have to go back to at least 500 years in order to see the picture in its totality. So, for example, 200 years ago, both China and India, for their added together, they constituted more than 60% of the world's GDP. And then so we have to trace how all these changed. And so my point is, if we have to go deep into this issue about the so-called global north and global south, there is a need for the global north to go back to their own history or to our own history, and then look at this history. So I remember what Ute Schopp, also our Peace Women board member from Germany, when she took me around to look at to visit the museums on Nazism, she said, there's a need not only to see how the victims had been victimized, you have to see the mentality and the whole approach of the perpetrators. Without that, then you cannot change the relationships. So I feel that is a very wise saying. So if we look at the question of debt, so we have to go back. And then my last point is, I don't think there's any need for guilt from those of us who now reside in the cities, or from those of us now in global north, for those of us who are men, I don't think there's the need to have this so-called guilt. I remember that at Muto Ichio, every time on July the 7th, that's the commemorative date of the US invasion of China, he would formally say, I, on behalf of our Japanese, we apologize to the Chinese people. So every time I would say there's no need to apologize because they had also been fighting against the militarism within Japan all the time. So we are fighting together. So there's no need for any guilt from us, but there need to be this strong sense for justice, historical justice, ecological and economic justice. That is the thing linking us together. And then in this solidarity and in this justice, then we move on. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I hope everybody kind of understood the essence of various meanings of Kinchi's point. You know, very important. Guilt, first of all, is useless in this, you know, in the context of creating change, because when you think about it, guilt is very self-centered. It's about you, first of all. Other responses, and Carla raised a really good point around this question of access, right? And that is age, and the ways in which it's very unusual to actually have intergenerational conversations, right? We had that earlier when we did the Violence Against Women panel, where there were participants of different generations. And, you know, Carla, I guess you're the official young person, right? But that's another kind of segregation that we don't talk about very often. Right? So we're talking about money, we're talking about language, right? We're talking about other kinds of material resources that are axes of power that that we need to really think through. And you know, another axis that Kinchi just raised is the whole way to think about history, right? And that the power isn't just the present power, but the ways in which that's been structured from the beginning, as it were, right? Of the colonial histories, the histories of extraction and militarism and wars. Are there other axes that we should talk about? Because I think because the next question is, so we've identified some of the contradictions, some of the tensions, the word Gabi used, tensions, right? What principles can we generate from those tensions and contradictions that we can say, to be ethically in solidarity, it's important to follow this principle or this particular value. Let's move in that direction, unless anyone has other points to make. And there's a chat in the box, Tangji, who says the origins of philanthropy has been based on extraction and expropriation, right? Per the logic of historic colonialism. And I think that is very, very clear. Right? Historical colonialism and present day exploitation. So if we go back to the tensions, right? What can we learn from the tensions that we just identified as a good starting place to begin to think about principles of ethical solidarity?
For me, all of these ethical issues, ethical principles between different human groupings really in my view, we cannot solve them until we reorganize our relationship with the ecosystem at large. And that is the biggest frame. If we think in terms of our problems in nested frames, that is the biggest frame. And it's almost futile to be trying to solve anthropocentric, if you like, human political issues unless these solutions are going to be compatible with ecological integrity, ecological sustainability. So I would want all of our debates to be framed in that way and to have that as an ethical reference point, a material ethical reference point in every discussion.
So if that were the case, Ariel, if you take any one of these axes, so donor relations, for example, and the contradiction around that, how would you have us think about that from that perspective that you just put forward?
Well, the whole conversation about donor relations assumes a continuation of the existing capitalist system that we're in. And that is totally incompatible with an ecological framework. So I would rather put the energies into looking at the donations which are coming to us free from nature itself, and to looking at how we can redesign our societies and relationships in a way that's harmonious with the continuation of the natural world.
Okay. Other ideas? You know, Gabi, I think you first. Oh, sorry, Gabi, you first raised this question of, you know, being connected to Switzerland, and on the one hand, weapons and all of that money made from that. Not to mention historically the money that was deposited by dictators and, you know, bad money, as it were, right, helped create the wealth of Switzerland, for example. So given that history, what would you suggest as a principle going forward? And this is a question for everyone that I think that would be a nice way to round out the conversation. So given what you spoke about, each of you, and what you heard from speakers, from the other speakers, right? What would you say is an important principle that would help address some of these axes of power that were just identified?
So it's interesting. I actually want to sort of challenge a little bit what Ariel said, you know, because I come from the environmental justice movement. And I think part of the environmental justice movement actually sees all of that, right? So I get the notion of the Anthropocene, and I think we have to be in right relationship to nature, and we have to actually have new articulations. You know, so many indigenous peoples with concept of buen vivir, the rights of nature movement that I think has been gaining a lot of ground. But there is also a different way in which we actually, sort of, it's been a historical domination and extraction. But I actually think that, to me, I think there's a fault line in that. Because I think we have to actually think about race, and I think we have to think about gender. And I think that there's no way around that. And it's not about intersectionality, actually. It's actually about how do we actually understand capitalism from its very origins. And I think for me, I agree with ultimately sort of a new economic political system. You know, what we're trying to actually talk about is an anti-racist, feminist, regenerative economy that's based on a lot of what you're saying. But I think I think we can't actually talk about justice without actually acknowledging sort of the historical and continued harm. I want to share just one thing that came out of actually the anti-NAFTA fights, the anti-free trade agreement fights. It's a document that actually was developed in 1996. And we actually use it, and we use it in the context, in the environmental and climate movement within the United States, because I think there's a deep history of racism in the environmental movement in particular, but there's also been a lot of in sort of DC kind of beltway policy and sort of NGO work. And these principles are called the Jemez principles for democratic organizing. And I think that, so there's 6 of them. And I think that there's some that it's a good start. And I think there needs to be more. But these Jemez principles are about, one, I think it's about sort of like being inclusive, but I think it's not from a tokenistic point of view. And I shared that earlier, but it's actually really thinking about like who's at the table. And people, you know, one of the indigenous brothers says that, you know, if we're not at the table, we're on the menu. And so part of it is like, how are we actually at the table from the very beginning? And historically, many times our communities are people from the global south, and it's always an afterthought. It's like being able to be brought folks in. I think the thing that I think is really important, and I think this app is a key component of ethical solidarity, is about letting people speak for themselves. And I think that it challenges our notions of who's an expert and then who gets listened to. And I think it also challenges our sort of also academic notions, right? Those of us who didn't go to school or didn't finish school or don't have degrees, like how do we actually create a way in which people express themselves? So it's not only in language justice, but also how do people speak for themselves? And this concept of self-determination, I think, is really important. And I think that and then the last piece, which is what you spoke about, Margo, which is a commitment to self-transformation, right? And I think this moment, there's a reckoning with white supremacy. There's a reckoning with the COVID crisis and the visibilization of reproductive labor. And what is the opportunity in this moment for transformation to happen at all levels? And I think that's the invitation that I think I want to have to all of us. It's like, what do we kind of shed? What do we kind of give birth to? What are we doulas in creating sort of the new for the future of humanity and the planet?
Thank you. Other ideas?
I think these ideas are not only new ideas. I think for years we are trying also to find a way to be more ethically, have a solidarity, ethic solidarity among us. But I think talking about it is one thing, but the difficult issue is implementing our ideas in the daily political practice, in the daily social practice. And I just realized that sometimes we are just scarce of time. And then we have to rush, we have to hurry, we have to go here and there and meet other people. That's one thing. And the other thing also is, I think we are not really ready to self-criticize, to make a self-critique, to reflect what we are talking, to have a constant circular self-reflection of what we are doing, being part of the capitalist system. So, I mean, the implementation of these ideas is the big challenge. And I'm now not that young anymore, but I still don't find good ways in how to establish a practice of ethical solidarity.
Great. Carla, Kozue?
I've been thinking, it has been very rich conversation, and I've learned a lot, and from everyone's comments, insight and perspectives. And I was thinking, given all these, could we work towards either a system or ideas to respect everyone's dignity? And that was the core idea of genuine security, feminist perspective of genuine security. One of the other core values, I think, Margo, you very briefly introduced at the beginning. And this may not be a very concrete this may not sound very concrete, but like those of us in the global north, I think need to like self-reflective on how we see those who are made othered. I think that's something that was made, the comment made earlier, but also our own, our own dignity, not the other material abundance, but are we very clear and assured about our own dignity, each one of us? So that's my last comment.
Thank you. That's an important point, right? The ways in which people in dominant groups are also dehumanized in a sense, right? And the benefits are usually seen in material terms. Gabi, did you want to add to this discussion about what do you think is an important principle or value? And Carla also.
I have a concern I would like to speak about. If we speak money from north to south, the refugees, the asylum seekers who are coming to our countries, they send per year from the north to the south, the poor people who are coming, the people who are expelled from their countries, send between 300 and 500 billions of dollars each year from the north to the south. So for me, it's crazy. People are expelled from the south to the north, or from warring countries. They are refugees and they are working in our countries. They sent back. The most important part of the money who goes to the south comes from people who are expelled from other countries to the north. So it is a terrible situation. Yesterday we spoke about violence against women in our countries. We forgot a little bit, we discussed about Rohingyas, but we forgot in a sense that violence against women is is in the world of the refugees is the norm. It's normal. Every woman, all the women are violated and raped and so on. They are coming to north, men and women, and they are so connected to their countries. They send back what they earn in these countries. And I think this is an issue we ever forgot when we speak about money who goes from the north to the south. A big
So the
part
money that doesn't just come from donors, it's families sending remittances back home, right?
from the refugees to their families.
Yes.
This is, I think, this is how to deal with this. It's a shame that the world functions like this. I would like. I would say.
Carla, did you want to contribute what you think is an important principle or value?
Yeah. I think what is really important is creating space for genuine human connection, or for really building relationships, and to really trying as best as you can to understand and really, I mean, it sounds really like touchy-feely kind of, but like to really feel what other people are going through and what other people are struggling with. And of course, that really requires us to care for ourselves, care for other people, which I think is such a feminist issue, like in the, of course, like in the economic terms and everything, but also it's something that is so looked down on, looked down at from in our society, many societies today, that it's like something soft and not that important. And I don't know, but like, I mean, the COVID crisis really shows how like essential it really is in times of crisis to care for each other and to really be a caring society. So I think that is a like super important principle. And yesterday the session on violence against women was a really good example of this. I think that you can read a lot and you can feel angry and sad and everything if you read stories of survivors of sexualized violence, for example. But if you see somebody speak about their own personal experience and about, or their mother's experience, you really can't like separate yourself from it. And I feel like we have learned so much, because there is so much like horrible things going on in the world. We have learned so much to shut off against these things as if they don't have anything to do with us. But if we really create like these human connections, then it has something to do with us, and then we have to care and we have to act. So I think that's really important.
Yeah, thank you. And that relates to, again, Tong Yi's comment about a Confucian ideal of pursuing relational virtuosity, right? How do we actually build relationships and make, instead of saying, oh, that's touchy-feely when we start talking about emotions or relationships, but really to embrace that. Kinchi, you wanted to make a comment as well.
Just very quickly, I think on this question of supremacy, I think maybe all of us will have some kind of supremacy. I don't know. So it's maybe we can be very critical about white supremacy or male supremacy or urban one. But then we talk about language and also all this idea about being a modern subject, and that is a very often we can see that in China, where some people feel they have been adequately modernized, so they look down on the peasants, on the countryside, etc. So I feel that on this question, we need to be having very self-critical ones and to be very honest with ourselves. But then on the other hand, we have Michel de Certeau writing in the 1970s about the silence of the Indians. We have Spivak, Gayatri Spivak, write about that the subaltern cannot speak. And I feel that to counter this question of supremacy, there's the word that Kozue just mentioned several times, the word dignity. And I think this acknowledging, recognizing the dignity in all their fight for justice. And I think that's also the word which I have found most used among the indigenous communities, with the Zapatistas, with many of the indigenous populations. They talk about dignity. And at the same time, they are so suppressed, they're so marginalized. So I feel that just now, I like the idea of course, talking about the relationships about with nature that Ariel talked about, the relationships with each other that Carla talked about. But I also feel that there is this most difficult thing of how we relate to our own selves, how we look at the kind of superiority complex that we have, which, and I often feel that the supremacy is sometimes built on a very bitter sense of inferiority, when we see that the ones who used to be on the other side now have assumed some kind of position which seem to be superior, and then we are not ready to recognize that. So I feel that maybe in that way, maybe if you say we should add some words for that, I think the respect for the dignity, but then also the capacity to interrogate our own selves about different things that we may have internalized.
Right. Thank you, Kinchi. And that's exactly what I was referring to when I said who would we have to become to actually live in the places we're trying to create without messing them up, right? So it's this question of our own personal development, and the question then becomes, how do we do that? And how do we put ourselves in situations where we can be disembedded from our own context so that we can see ourselves in ways that we couldn't because we're so embedded, right? What kinds of settings do we need to create for that kind of interaction so that we can see ourselves differently? And maybe that's a kind of a task, for us to create spaces, and not just abstract spaces where we're just talking, right? But can we build this kind of awareness building as we're doing the work of creating, right? Shouldn't that be very centrally included as part of, quote, the work of making social change?